Welcome to the Host Burns channel. I am your host Burns for another video that you will be waiting for. So focus, relax, watch and enjoy, and don't forget, subscribe and press the notification bell. Let's start. Number 6. The Pope Prisoners. For about 60 years, not a single pope left Vatican City. It was one of the weirdest times in the Vatican's history, which saw each pope become a prisoner of their own little kingdom. It had been a long time in the making, and it finally came into effect on May 13, 1871. The Italian law of guarantees was the Kingdom of Italy's attempt at solving their pope problem. They hated that the pope had so much influence and power over the people, and so the law was aimed at forcing the Holy See to be an ordinary subject of Italy and not a sovereign. They promised to treat the pope with similar honors that they would give to a king, but he was to be under strict Italian law. In response, 5 popes locked themselves inside the Palace of the Vatican and didn't leave, starting with Pope Pius IX, who died in 1878. The Pope was so furious that he excommunicated the King of Italy, basically sentencing him to a lifetime in hell. It ended with Pope Pius XI, who eventually worked out a new deal with Benito Mussolini in 1929. They decided that Vatican City would be its very own country, which it still is today. Number 5. The Black Magic Grimoire. The Black Magic Grimoire is exactly what it sounds like. It's an ancient book of black magic that's been dated back anywhere from 1421 to 1521. However, no historian has ever agreed on when the first edition was published. Expert Owen Davies says it was 1702 when the first edition was made available, but other more mainstream scholars suggest it was written in the 19th century as a kind of hoax. Anything we know about the Black Magic Grimoire, also known as the Grand Grimoire, is vague at best. The introductory chapter was likely written by a man named Antonio Veneciana del Rabina, and he got much of his information from the original writings of the great King Solomon. Many of the black magic spells in the book are variations of the Key of Solomon or the Red Dragon. So what does a book on black magic have to do with the Vatican? Rumor has it that an original copy is secured somewhere inside their archives. We don't know if any of it is true, but that's what some sources say. And considering the Vatican archives are home to pretty much every relevant religious text in the world, it wouldn't be a big surprise. It makes sense that they would keep a secret book hidden that can supposedly summon Lucifer and give one the ability to make a deal with the devil. Number 4. Jesus' Death Certificate. The Shroud of Turin is a small piece of linen cloth that appears to show the imprint of the face of Jesus Christ. It looks kind of like a negative from a roll of film. Religious scholars believe the shroud was wrapped around the body of Christ after his death, which is why his face was left imprinted on it. The shroud was first mentioned in 1354 and quickly became one of the most legendary religious artifacts in the world. It was kept inside the royal chapel at the Cathedral of Turin in northern Italy ever since 1578. But the truth of the shroud is quite controversial. In 1988, tests proved it came from the Middle Ages, about 1,200 years after Christ's recorded death. But recently, Barbara Frail, a researcher with the Vatican's secret archives, says that traces of writing were found on the shroud, which has turned it into a kind of death certificate. Barbara says the fragments of words discovered on the shroud were written in Greek, Hebrew, and Latin, and say something like, "This shroud was placed over Jesus of Nazareth." This is information coming straight from somebody who works in the Vatican. It's now believed that this mysterious piece of linen was used by a clerk following Jesus' execution. His name was written on it in many different languages, then laid around his body before he was buried. Either it's real, and this really is Jesus Christ's actual death certificate, a legitimate document of death, or the Vatican is just telling stories. What do you think? Number 3. The Pope Escape Tunnels. The Passetto di Borgo looks like any other old stone fortification in Vatican City. It runs 2,600 feet straight from the city to the Castel Sant'Angelo, and most people don't know what in the world it even is. This stone fortification was once a secret passageway used for popes to escape from harm. The passage, which from the outside honestly just looks like an ordinary wall, was constructed starting in 850 AD at the behest of Pope Nicholas III. that it wasn't finished for roughly 650 years until the reign of Pope Alexander VI in 1492. He was famous for corruption and nepotism, using his position and money to take care of his illegitimate children. Anyway, he finished the passageway just in time. Pope Alexander used his newly completed escape tunnel to escape when the French invaded 2 years later. All that effort really didn't amount to much, with only a handful of popes ever needing it. The last flight was in 1527, when Pope Clement VII had to escape the mutinous troops from the Holy Roman Emperor's imperial army. The troops had turned against Charles V and marched on Rome, and Clement VII was one of the few high-level people to escape, all thanks to his sneaky tunnel. In 2000, as a way to honor the Roman Catholic Church's Great Jubilee year, the Passetto was refurbished. In recent years, the church has opened the tunnels to visitors for a restricted amount of time during each summer. Number 2. Lucifer. There are some who say that hidden in the bowels of the Vatican is proof that the devil exists. These are the same people who believe the Vatican is holding evidence of extraterrestrials. And in another puzzling conspiracy theory, there are people out there who believe the entire Catholic Church, all of Vatican City, and the Pope himself are controlled by Lucifer, all of them puppets of the devil. But this is all just wild conspiracy theory speculation. It's true that we don't know if the devil exists. The only church that has a devil inside of it is the Holy Trinity Church in Westminster. The church was built specifically to celebrate the defeat of Napoleon. Lucifer's portrayal lives inside this church in the United Kingdom, but it's not what you think. The devil was put here by a local artist, a man named Paul Fryer, who created a grotesque statue of Lucifer in wax with wings made of actual feathers caught up in power cables. It's one of the creepiest things in any church, especially one that's been in use for over a century, although it hasn't been used as a place of worship since the 1930s. But of course, it's just an artist's disturbing work, not proof that the devil is running the Vatican. Number 1. The Resurrection. Speaking of creepy sculptures, there is an extremely disturbing sculpture that's actually inside the Vatican. It's called the Resurrection, and it was modeled in 1977 out of bronze and copper by an artist named Vatican. It's about 66 feet long and 23 feet tall, and is the current backdrop for the stage in the Vatican's Paul VI Audience Hall. The Audience Hall is the source of quite a few conspiracy theories, almost all of them caused by the oddly horrific sculpture rising above the head of the frail old Pope. Even though the sculpture is meant to depict the resurrection of Christ, it looks like a bunch of melted snakes all tied together with some kind of demon rising from a reactive black goo. Mr. Pazzini must have gotten his inspiration from some horror movie. The hall itself is where the Pope holds all his weekly meetings when the weather isn't good enough to be in St. Peter's Square. This sculpture, believe it or not, is actually supposed to instill a kind of shock in people when they see it for the first time, and has a prominent place in the hall because the sculptor wanted to remind all the Pope's audience that, as Christians, they shouldn't be afraid of what's to come when Jesus Christ is resurrected. Instead, they should accept the great cataclysm that will be upon them and rejoice in the resurrection, even if the world is thrown into a horrifying maelstrom of chaos and death.